Lane here. Welcome back to Humans of Ethereum. This show is all about discovering and sharing the human stories behind the projects and the technologies in the Ethereum community. In this episode, we hear one of those stories from Santiago Siri of Democracy Earth. Santi has a really unique, fascinating background. He transitioned from being a games developer to actually founding a political party in his native Argentina. Today, along with his colleagues at the Democracy Earth Foundation, he's doing really essential work reimagining and reinventing democracy using technologies like Ethereum. We also had a chance in this episode to discuss some of the really big picture questions like humans versus AI and kind of what the blockchain means to us all as a society. Without further ado, let's kick off with episode 2 of Humans of Ethereum featuring Santiago Siri of Democracy Earth. Hey, thanks for making time to chat and be part of the Humans of Ethereum interview series. Let's kind of dive in. So, my primary motivation in having these conversations is to explore the human side of, the humans of Ethereum, I guess, right? So the amazing human beings such as yourself who are doing, really important work. And so I'd love to actually start with just background, like tell us a little bit about yourself, introduce yourself in whatever way you think would be most interesting. Tell us in particular what you were doing before you got into blockchain and Ethereum and Democracy Earth. And I guess leading into just kind of like, this should be a very easy question for you, knowing you, but kind of, what excites you and what motivates your work?
So I'm 35 years old. I'm from Buenos Aires, Argentina. And probably the last 7 years, I got involved in understanding this intersection or exploring this intersection of politics and the internet, of the traditional legacy institutional power and the emergent rise of these networks that are connecting us in completely new ways. And being raised in Argentina, suddenly being exposed to a technology that offers a very tangible alternative to a very fraudulent banking system and political system made me want to double down on the many ideas that I see emerge coming from the world of crypto. I find in Ethereum a lot of very relevant experimentation on the nature of institutions, in the nature of organizations, really going one step beyond just the mere use of blockchains for financial functions. And in that regard, what I've been trying to understand these years as a developer, I started as a game developer, I've been a programmer almost my whole life, is how we can use this technology to deploy democracies anywhere in the world at the lowest possible cost that can be censorship resistant, not be controlled by any nation state or corporation, and that we can trust that are giving us the most real result and outcome for every electoral process out there. I think this can be done, but we need to understand a lot of very different parts of the puzzle. And I really like that you named these humans on the blockchain, because it boils down to understanding who we are as humans and how these networks acknowledge us as humans. And what is this boundary between machine intelligence, capital, and the control we keep as a society beyond just greedy financial interests, and start thinking in new political ways that can scale for the whole world. And that's what I work on today. That's a very philosophical description probably of what we try to do with Democracy Earth, but understanding this stack between the human element of these networks, the social element, and how it connects to the machine capital element of them is really, it's been a very interesting part of my research in the recent years.
I didn't make that connection until just now, but of course, the tension, or I guess kind of the intersection, as well as understanding the boundaries of kind of humans versus AI, or I think you call them replicants in your white paper. Is that right?
We keep changing the metaphors based on the sci-fi we like in the moment. Replicants probably comes from Blade Runner, but
of course.
But yeah, these civils, or Agent Smith, however you want to call it, deep fakes. Can you really trust that I'm the guy you are talking with?
Are you really Santi Siri? I may have to ask you some. So it's fascinating, right? Because the way I framed Humans of Ethereum is, of course, speaking to humans like yourself and hearing people's backstory and their motivations and asking them deep questions. But maybe another framing of quote unquote humans of Ethereum or humans of the blockchain or humans of the network or something is what sets us apart from the machines or the replicants, especially as they gain the ability increasingly to imitate us and sort of approach this Blade Runner dystopian future. We'll come back to that in a moment. We'll talk more about how Democracy Earth is attacking that. But maybe tell us what you were doing before getting into Bitcoin and Ethereum and kind of how that happened.
So my first experience being a hacktivist was with the political party. I started along with some colleagues and friends back in Argentina. Partido de la Red had candidates that were committed to vote in Congress, always according to what people tell them online how to vote. So that meant that we had to figure out how to do software for democracy, for people to be able to participate over their phones or over their computers. And at the same time, building a political party in a very hostile environment like Argentina, facing a very corrupt system and trying to run for elections, actually running, campaigning, getting the votes, counting the votes, and then dealing with a very weird Leviathan political machinery and understanding some of the realpolitik elements of engaging with that type of entity or organizations. And in 2015, we get a grant from Y Combinator to start researching about the software side of things in San Francisco. And there, I start actively working on how we can use blockchain-based networks to deploy democracies. We have done every experiment. We have done liquid democracy, direct democracy, participatory budgeting, all kinds of arrangements. And we have worked with political parties, non-profit organizations, parliaments, and blockchain-based networks. And we have systematically been attacked in every relevant implementation, because when it's a high-stakes decision, it's very likely that someone will try to subvert your system. So it's very tough to make this type of systems. And usually the higher the risk, the higher the need for legitimacy in the decision-making process. That's when democracy really matters, when it's really hard to make a decision as a community or as a collective. So today, fast forward to today, one of the most interesting ideas that we're exploring on the economical side of how we can structure a democracy is this idea led by Glenn Weil, who is the author of the original paper called Quadratic Voting. We implemented this for the state of Colorado that helped the state of Colorado sort out a list of 107 bills and understand which is the top priority and the second and the third in a very organic data distribution, which is a consequence of using quadratic voting. So it was a very successful implementation, and we are actively talking with the Parliament of Canada, with the state of California, and other organizations are interested in implementing these new economic models to collective decision-making. And the other aspect is understanding where the human is. There's a lot of very interesting projects in this area. There's a Humanity DAO happening with Ethereum. There's a project using Turing-resistant proofs, meaning Turing tests that cannot be captured by machine learning intelligence, that require to be tests that are AI hard, not about pattern recognition, and also not generated by algorithms. And we are in the middle of this storm of ideas, trying to understand how to break down the problem in simpler parts and ship some solutions and concrete ideas. And we are working on this experiment still, and we always want to work with organizations that are facing a real decision and are willing to surrender that decision to a new kind of democratic making decision process. That was a lot, probably. Sorry for just going ranting.
No, that's great. That's really helpful. I was sort of in the process of formulating 2 or 3 follow-up questions, and I think you actually answered all of them as you were speaking.
We know each other very well right now.
This is true. We could probably finish each other's sentences. But this is a great segue into the next question I wanted to ask, which is, what does Ethereum mean or represent to you, and maybe to Democracy Earth as well?
So I got into crypto in the early days, 2011. Yeah, I was very lucky that way because I was already interested in virtual currencies from a project I actually worked in 2009. That was based about using your social reputation on social media. We actually applied PageRank to weight retweets on Twitter. And I was already with the antenna calibrated to understand virtual currency. Bitcoin appears in my radar somewhere around 2011. You know, I figured out very quickly that was a very real technology available to achieve things that no other financial technologies were able to achieve. And in Argentina, it was a survival tool. Because in the early days, I guess I got somewhat lucky with Bitcoin. You also tend to become a bit greedy about it, and you kind of develop this maximalist mindset. I went through a phase like that, and completely fearful of anything that wasn't not Bitcoin, you know, because my money was on Bitcoin, and money can be a very corrupting force in many ways. So we have to be aware of how money plays a role in our own opinions, in our own influence. I probably heard first about Ethereum. I remember seeing the Ethereum ICO. I had some friends that participated in that. I didn't dare to participate myself, but I was curious to watch how that whole thing went through. Early videos about Vitalik in YouTube, maybe 2014. I remember back in Buenos Aires, 2015, 2016. I followed the whole DAO thing, the DAO thing, the DAO hack. Kind of made me a bit scared about Ethereum back then. It was like, okay, it's still very early about this. But then I had a very good friend in New York who I'm talking with right now that came from, I remember you came from DevCon, and you really taught me a lot of things about the excitement of the community building with Ethereum. And as a developer myself, I actually built with Bitcoin. We did a referendum for the Hong Kong umbrella movement in 2016, 800,000 users. We stored votes using Bitcoin, storing a Merkle, the root of a Merkle tree on the up return field of a Bitcoin transaction. That way, this technique is known as chain point, and you were able to store up to 10,000 votes per validated, verified Bitcoin transaction. We got hacked by Chinese hackers, so we stored in the blockchain, even in the Bitcoin blockchain, even fake Chinese votes. There was an issue with the interface that was an interface built for Telegram. This was a shadow referendum for electing a mayor in Hong Kong. Hong Kong is like extremely cutting edge about technology. You can read some interviews about the umbrella movement guy that worked with us, Angus, and you know, it was one of those things you just fall into, and you're okay. Let's use Bitcoin for an election, and in a very competitive context, or you know, with a lot of turmoil. I learned very quickly that, you know, about the limitations for building with Bitcoin. And as a developer, as I started diving deeper into what Ethereum allows, how Ethereum works, understanding, of course, you know, that it's a project in its early days, that, you know, everyone who has been doing so for long enough knows how hard it is to do stuff like this. But the fact that you had a completely programmable blockchain, you know, today, 2019, we are already seeing incredible success in derivative products built on top of Ethereum. Like the case of MakerDAO. MakerDAO is one of those projects that, as an Argentine, having a central bank where I can somehow participate in the interest fee, and I can loan myself money without ever presenting any credentials, that's like the future. And it's a very clear financial reality of the Ethereum protocol right now. We're no longer discussing if Ethereum works. It works, and it's even doing this stuff. You know, you want to call it layer 2, you want to call it derivatives applications. It is already proving to, you know, to generate this new financial reality. I'm curious to see how we can also pursue with these technologies the political side of things. I don't want the internet to just stop at the banks. I want also the internet to go for the governments, to go for, you know, humanity as a whole. I think we owe it. Our generation, the next generations will even understand it even better than us. And for that, we need programmability. We need also a culture that it's welcoming to very diverse mindsets, and that it struggles and works hard to make sure everyone is able to get along, because these protocols are not just the technicals, you know, and it's not just how the algorithm works and just the fetishism of, oh, look how this proof of work works. No, there's way more than, you know, we need to face society. We don't need to face the machines. And in that regard, I still see Ethereum as an incredible ecosystem and community and environment.
Cool. Yeah, a lot of what you say resonates quite strongly for me. So Ethereum is a community and an ecosystem. As you said, it's, there's this DeFi stuff happening, which you touched upon when you mentioned Maker. It's maybe a platform to build voting or democracy 2.0, which of course is the vertical that you guys are focusing on. Can we capture what all that is? I learned a phrase yesterday, which I think you might like. I liked it quite a bit. It was Turing complete institution. Because you can configure Ethereum, or build things on it that come to resemble pretty much every institution in the world. I call Ethereum a operating system for building better human institutions, or maybe for building, Turing complete human institutions, any sort of human institution. Do you have any thoughts? Like, what is it to you?
So to me, it's exciting that it is still such a pioneering age, but in my mind, there is no doubt that we should be pursuing this direction. It is simply not fair that for the fact that you are born in this random lottery on any given country, your fate in life on Earth is completely predetermined by that. If you're born probably in a G7 nation, you just got the lottery ticket for the most part. Or if you were born, in a high class in a poor country, probably the same. So how we can use information technology to make sure that the starting point for anyone that arrives to this planet is the same. And in that regard, structuring the right to organize, the right to assemble, the right to free speech, all of these institutions, with the use of digital networks, with technology that moves at light speed, it's harder and harder to censor for centralized authority, it is an incredible opportunity. So what I like about what emerges coming from the Ethereum community and the different ideas that are being exposed, for example, how the DAO concept has been evolving, this idea of being able to do continuous organizations that fundraise throughout time, or this idea of organizing the governance over a DAO with a function that mitigates risk of the participants, allowing them at any moment to rage quit. So what are these inherent properties of a digital company that are simply unthinkable from the paradigm of legacy institutions, because you are bounded to pay to a nation state or to a government and to a territory and to a piece of land, and to here you are not, in this spectrum of digital information, you can actually explore your politics in parallel, putting your assets in chains that have conflicting ideologies. Whereas in the traditional world, you live politics in a serial way, and you have to, you are either under a left or right-wing government, one step at a time. I see tremendous potential in these technologies. What I'm doing right now is paying a lot of close attention to these experiments, learning, reading the smart contracts. I like the idea that a lot of them are actually pretty simple, 200 lines of code. Recently, I've been looking at the stuff of Humanity DAO, which is applies the idea of a token curated registry to vote over identities. And the sooner we get these experiments, the sooner we'll understand if any of these approaches work. But this amount of experimentation over the institutional layer of the world is really the way forward. And I think we're very lucky to have a lot of people contributing ideas in this space out in the open. Vlad Samfir, Vitalik, all of these guys. I definitely think that this is a tremendous tool, and we must make sure that it goes to the next level. What I care about is understanding how can this help improve democracy, because right now democracy is broken. It's pretty much broken everywhere. The internet broke it. Let's not blame it on Mark. He's just, probably the scapegoat, because it's powerful. Like,
it's the same as blaming Donald Trump for the, what's wrong with the United States. It's the other way around. He's sort of the symptom, not the cause. I think I agree with you.
Exactly.
I like that you mentioned experimentation. Another metaphor that I found helpful is that of a VM, as opposed to kind of like a hardware machine, or like a quote unquote metal computer. Right. So I'd like to say that Ethereum is to existing human institutions as VMs are to hardware. Right. The idea being that if you rewind 10 or 20 years, you and I are old enough to remember the 90s when you needed to have a physical, piece of hardware if you wanted to kind of, start a project or a company or something. And then virtualization came along and VMs came along, and it became possible to kind of spin up and tear down lots and lots and lots of systems very cheaply, which of course is what's allowed apps like Marx, to kind of scale the way they have. In the same way, we now have the ability to do that, this sort of virtualization with things like economies and systems of government, right? We can kind of spin up a bunch of them. Like you said, you can kind of allocate, a few of your assets to kind of different experiments, and we let them run for a while because they're kind of like these little self-contained, experiments, right? And then we kind of see which ones work. Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
I mean, it's funny you mentioned games, because game theory is, very central to what we do, right? And then the ones that don't work, you kind of tear them down and you replace them, just like we do with virtual hardware.
It is the weaponization age of game theory, like this field that emerges, 50s, 60s, out of the fear of nuclear warfare and understanding how we can think many moves ahead. It's funny, do you know how to play Go?
I've played it. I'm not very good at it. I mean, I spent some time living out in, China and Japan, where it's quite popular.
I recently had a lesson with a friend of mine, and I was fascinated by it, on how it was actually a game that precedes language itself. Probably it was used as a medium of communication. It is kind of like a primitive computer in many ways, and it has a lot of emergent behavior, like Conway's Game of Life. And the thing about games is that our mind can only acquire new knowledge through a state of play. Every single institution that we have is really an arrangement around that play state of mind. The financial system is a scorekeeping game. The politics is a theatrical play. And it is really interesting. I began my career as a game developer. And what made me make this leap into stop doing just games for recreation or entertainment and start working on real games that have real impact in the real world was in a game developers conference when I met a Marine, a US Marine. I thought he was like a guy dressed up as a Marine. And a friend of mine told me that the #1 recruiting tool of the US Army is this game called America's Army. So games are already like, literally sending people to war. They're a political tool. And that goes to the nature of how we can coordinate society itself, how we can coordinate our resources. The thing about software, doing it in software form, is that it can scale to the whole world. We can scale and start giving rights in a much more fundamental way than relying on authority. But we need to understand how we think about what it means to have an identity without a big brother that acknowledges your identity. And those are some big questions that we're facing.
Yeah, no, that's fascinating. I think you were the one who introduced me to Homo Ludens, which of course was a book. I can't remember the name of the author. Do you remember?
Johan Huizinga, Dutch philosopher. The book is from 1933. Like the best literature of the 20th century is right before the Second World War.
And I think the core central argument to the book is what you were hinting at a moment ago, which is that we only progress as individuals, we only learn, we only progress our society through games and there's just a certain mode that our minds get into when we engage in games that allow us to open ourselves up, I think, to kind of new ideas and learning, right?
Yeah.
That's fascinating. So maybe Satoshi was the greatest dungeon master, the greatest game master in history.
Yeah, cryptographers are aliens that way.
I want to touch briefly upon something that you mentioned a couple of times, which was kind of maximalism, tribalism. You also mentioned that it's important that in the Ethereum community or in any of these communities that we be very welcome and opening to newcomers. My version of the story, you were obviously right there as I kind of made my own journey down the rabbit hole in 2017. I was very turned off by what was happening in the Bitcoin community at that time, and felt much more welcomed by the people and the communities that I met in the Ethereum community. So I feel very strongly that this matters a great deal. I think one of the greatest ironies of Ethereum today is that it was in many ways created, as a reaction to a perception of, kind of lack of progress in Bitcoin. And I'm not sure if there was as much tribalism at that time because that's a bit more before my time. But, a mere 4 or 5 years later, Ethereum is now experiencing quite a bit of this as well, of kind of the types of kind of maximalism and tribalism that you mentioned. And you began to describe why that's the case, right? It has to do with skin in the game and has to do with personal investment, both, I guess, of time and energy, as well as kind of financial investment. Just wondering if you have any other thoughts on kind of what we can do about this.
Well, Nietzsche used to say that the identity of a city or a town evolves in opposition to their neighbors. And I think it happens with Ethereum being much more welcoming of diversity as being built in opposition to Bitcoin's toxicity, which even some people actually brag about within the Bitcoin community. I think that the spirit of communities really matters a lot. It's hard to forget about that when you are seduced by capitalism. But it's, we are humans, we're people, we're trying to help each other. That I also had that same sensation with the Bitcoin community over the years. It grew more snarky and either you're with us or against us. It's a deeply political space, and by no means this means that I'm against the Bitcoin project. I actually try to, have a non-dual mindset about things. It's not a zero-sum game. There's greater things that unite us, and we should be thinking about those things as well. But it is a matter of concern. Community really matters to me, and we should be very responsible with that, because I think that what we're witnessing with these networks is that there's a big transfer of value happening, with the rise of crypto, with the rise of these networks. And there's probably a new elite brewing up that's gonna eventually replace the banking or the political elite for a programming elite. What does, these networks are leading to, in many cases, to positions of power, of influence, and it's like a generational change at the same time. It's a very big change. So in that regards, I think it's a responsibility to make sure that these technologies help, the knowledge about these technologies becomes democratized and becomes much more common for the average user, because ultimately what we want is to empower people against big oppressive regimes and big oppressive governments or financial coercion. And I think we can allow ourselves to think in much more creative terms than just sticking behind an ideology. Nationality emerged as a consequence of an information technology. As communities were able to start printing books in their vernacular languages, French, Spanish, Portuguese, this gave rise to the notion that the united community were the French or the Spanish, and not everyone bounded to the church in Rome as that wrote in Latin and only spoke in Latin, and no one was told how to speak in Latin. But when people in the 1600s, Don Quixote, Shakespeare, whatever, you started printing the information in their local folkloric languages, then the idea of nations emerged, and that led to the rise of the French Revolution and the nation state, and all of these constructs of power that have scaled to the whole world. We live in a world of nation states. I used to think that, okay, with the internet, we'll have the nation of nations. We'll have this one final place. That was
the techno-utopian vision from the 90s. I guess
yeah.
In the 80s. I'm barely old enough to remember a little bit, but I guess we both are.
We shouldn't just bury it yet. I think that the Imagine song, which by the way, the lyrics were by Yoko Ono, not by John Lennon, is a beautiful anthem to start for as a humanity to start looking into that goal. We shouldn't just let that go. But what seems to be happening is this idea of maximalism as the new nationalism, that communities are organizing now behind these protocols in the same way that they organize behind language with the rise of the printing press. And what keeps these communities together is ideology. If you are into Ayn Rand and Mises and Hayek and sound money and all the memes that make the Bitcoin community what it is, and it's a great resource to learn about them. Definitely, I would encourage anyone to dive deep into a lot of the literature around there. But Bitcoin is building this global nation of libertarians. Is Ethereum, the other one? There are other blockchain projects out there that are also building their own tribes, their own sovereignties. But we are organizing now as a connected species into these new boundaries, these new territories. which are information-based, they are not land-based. And we are starting to see that we have these frontiers where we troll each other because of our ideological differences. And maybe that's the new territory.
Trolling is what unites us. I like that. We replace violence, and we replace physical armies with troll armies.
Yeah.
This is probably the most important thing we can be talking about, and this is obviously my favorite thing to talk about with you. Is you get past the kind of financial economic aspects, you get even past the technology, and kind of, I call it the ground floor of the rabbit hole, of course, is the social side of things. And as you help me understand, Bitcoin emerged in a particular time, in a particular place, in response to a particular set of socioeconomic circumstances. And I really like zooming out as far as we are right now and talking about, about history and about how humans have organized ourselves over centuries and millennia. And it's just quite interesting. I had a bit of a realization as you were describing this a moment ago. If the printing press had the effect, and kind of words and language had the effect that you described, which I agree that they did, clearly words and knowledge are very powerful, but so is money, right? Mm-hmm. And so we now have the tools with Bitcoin to do the same thing with money, and maybe via Ethereum, even more than money, with institutions in general. And so if the printing press led to that sort of a transformation and a reorganization of human society, then it's terrifying and awesome in the original meaning of the word awesome, to kind of think about where we're heading and what this means, and a bit scary to think about how we get there. But I'm glad to know that people like you are thinking about this.
I think it is very relevant that we try to experiment and learn from this as fast. But I tend to be an optimist about these technologies and about our capacity as a civilization to overcome our differences. I guess there's a reason why we're 7 billion in the planet now. We seem to have mastered some kind of thing, and I think it relates to understanding information better, understanding how we communicate ideas in a much more democratizing and scalable way. I think there's no way back. There's no way we're gonna face the challenges we face as a global civilization with the tools that simply are not apt to the day and age we live in. I think it's very important also to engage with traditional legacy institutions and teach them about these technologies, and to make a new layer or a transition that is as peaceful as possible.
I agree. We could spend hours discussing this topic, and we have. I'm sure we will, and hopefully we'll have more airtime in the future to go much deeper on this topic, because it is so important. But I do want to change gears slightly and make sure we get to another important topic, which is around kind of funding and just kind of sustainability in the economic or human resources sense of the word. So tell us how you guys have supported your work at Democracy Earth Foundation up to now. What's working, what's not working, what you're planning for the future.
So Democracy Earth Foundation is already almost 5 years old. I started in 2015. We are a nonprofit organization, 501c3. We started in California, and now also with a legal presence in New York, and now, because I'm in Madrid, also with an entity here. So we started as an organization pretty much inspired by other nonprofits in tech that I always liked, like Mozilla or Wikipedia, Wikimedia, Creative Commons. I always looked up to those organizations, the Free Software Foundation. There are so many examples. But,
don't forget EFF.
Of course, the EFF. There's a lot of those in San Francisco. The Bay Area has always been very inspiring to me. So when we got the grant from YC, it was the opportunity to start thinking an organization along these lines. Over the past 5 years, we've been able to raise something close to $2 million. Of that, 1.5 million in crypto through a fully regulated offering. Because we're in the United States, we did a Reg D offering, which allows us to raise up to 5 million without public solicitation. So we never did an ICO or anything like that. And at the same time, we also had donations. As a 501c3, we've been able to raise a little bit it's going to be probably $700,000 worth of donations. In some cases from individual donors. We have, I think, probably over 100 donors by now. And in some cases by philanthropic organizations. it is, I always try to make sure that we do something by the book, because it is the Wild West out there. And I think reputation is the most important thing you have as an organization, especially in an industry that there's a lot of noise. And it is really, scary sometimes, just any slight thing you do in public in the crypto industry, you will have an army of trolls saying crazy shit about you. And I learned that in politics. In politics, you are really exposed, and people go really bananas when you are trying to, and people are very suspicious, and with good reason sometimes, when you are going for power. So that's why we never been an organization that was very flamboyant on an ICO or raising millions and millions, because we are more of a guerrilla team, a small team, doing little experiments with different organizations and building reports around that. The most recent thing, it's still not officially public, but we're among friends here. We got this grant from the Templeton Foundation, which is an extraordinary organization. It's a $230,000 grant, which is great for us to work on this idea of how we can use Turing-resistant proofs or Turing tests that cannot be captured by machine learning with protocols that operate over these decentralized networks. We have a responsibility now to distill this into a proof of concept technology. We have some ideas, and actually I'm discovering as I dive deeper into this problem that we have just a responsibility to coordinate some efforts that are happening already, even in Ethereum itself. In some cases, not still fully Ethereum, but because we have been trying to work on this for so long now, you just discover these projects out there. And looking forward, I want to make sure that we get to be a place for testing early ideas around how to make democratic DAOs, or how we can allow for much better scalable decision-making process. We have quadratic voting ideas like coming from the radical exchange movement. We have Humanity DAO trying to figure out TCRs to validate identities over the blockchain. There's this project called IDENA that is trying to do Turing-resistant proofs, and they have done incredible Turing games that they claim that are not capturable by machine learning, and the criteria that they use is really, really smart. There's a lot of things happening in the space, and I'm being sucked into these projects, and in the next 6 months we're going to be working aggressively on this as we try to push a model that can, the end game for us is how we can give anyone this technology that you just deploy a democracy. You can trust the result of what that election delivers over this network, and this network cannot be censored by any government. And if you have that thing, you just can deploy democracies anywhere there is an internet connection. You can start building legitimacy in parallel to the traditional legitimacy of traditional power. I have seen how elections work from the inside. You have no idea how rigged the system is. And when you start understanding why it is so rigged and in what details, especially in the developing world, holy shit, we need this. Needs to happen. Because once we find the right, how the pieces fitting together the right way, boom, it's just dynamite laid from there on. But figuring all of these pieces is not trivial, and that's why it's a very important responsibility for this to become an effort of the community as a whole. And it can be something that just comes from one single organization. And this is an epiphany that I'm having as I grew up as a developer myself, as being injected into this great community. Like, the more time I spent in DevCon or Web3 on all of the events happening, the F NYC or the next F Berlin, I'm looking forward to that. The more time I spent with you guys, the more humbled I am. And I'm like, okay, I don't know shit, and I'm gonna start asking questions. I'm a bit shy sometimes, but I've been able to approach everyone with my crazy questions, and there's something in the air here. I feel like I found an army I want to belong to, a guerrilla I want to fight for, and that's why I'm here, I guess.
That's incredible. Yeah, I think I got some shivers down my spine as you were, because I've had a similar set of experiences. I felt that way. My first Ethereum event was DevCon 3 in Cancun in October of 2017. And again, I mentioned this before, but that's why I ended up joining the Ethereum community rather than the Bitcoin community. I really like your vision of kind of democracy in a box. I have been, as you know, following your work for quite some time, but I hadn't conceived of democracy Earth in exactly those terms before. And I just thought I had this vision of like, you know, the printing press maybe created knowledge in a box, so to speak, in the form of books, right? Or at least made that process orders of magnitude faster and cheaper. In a sense, like what you're doing with Democracy Earth is you're creating these grenades that you can just lob, you know, everywhere. It's just kind of like democracy, 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 you know. And like you said, it's not that it needs to be there necessarily from the beginning. It's not necessarily about creating new things. It's about building parallel structures and sort of alternative options in parallel to what's already there. And just kind of showing people that there is an alternative and showing people the power of democracy and accountability.
I want to allow every single election happening to be implemented in parallel over this network, either whether it's a referendum, whether it's a public election for public office, or whether it's even a vote happening in Congress. Every single vote happening in every single Congress, in every single city, in every single country. Let's replicate all of that in the blockchain and make those elections perpetual, always on. Let's not allow them to have a closing date, so we can see how public opinion, you know, shifts through different processes. And let's have smart ways about tallying those votes, but ways where we can actually find common ground. And you know, the incredible thing is that both the hardware and the software, the ideas and the technologies that can help us achieve this, they're kind of emerging. And you know, I guess our job is to, you know, figure out how to connect the cables.
Definitely. Yeah, I think that's a very powerful vision. I'm especially excited about this idea of doing it in parallel. You know, there's a space which I'm sure you're familiar with in Prague, and in Protestant parallelní polnost, right, which means parallel society, something like that. It's a metaphor that I often invoke in my talks on this topic. You know, it's sort of evolution, not revolution. You know, we're not necessarily trying to tear things down the way other movements are trying to do. We're really trying to offer a better alternative. Cool. I want to talk a tiny bit about community, which you mentioned a moment ago, obviously. And I think I'm paraphrasing here, but you said something like, we can't do this alone. You know, this has to be something that's driven by the community. You know, on the one hand, I get those shivers down my spine as well, you know, when I'm in events and I'm, you know, appreciate fully the power of a community like the Ethereum community. But there's a flip side for me, which is that as someone who participates, as you know, in Ethereum governance, I sometimes really struggle to understand exactly what that word means and exactly who is in the community and how to hear their voice. And, you know, as you know as well, we have very limited signaling tools right now. What does community mean to you and to Democracy Earth? And how do you leverage the strength, or just kind of get, what's the word I'm looking for, enfranchisement or buy-in from the community?
I think, you know, now that I just moved to Spain, I'm rediscovering a lot of the connective tissue of community, living here in a country with a lot of shared values and with a different view about life. After coming from New York, at least, where everything is work, 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 money, 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 nonstop, conquer the world. If you're not conquering the world, you know, you're no one. Whereas here in Spain, suddenly, you know, it's a different connection to life. You're allowed to have a long lunch and, you know, have a beer at 10 a.m. in the morning. I'm still struggling with that a little bit, but my sensation is that there's a very strong connective tissue in this community, and it's refreshing me some insights or a way of life that I actually had back in Argentina, and that it's as important as it is to improve our tools and improve our technology and improve our capital and financial structuring. But you know, there's an old book called it's not that old, it's probably 5-10 years old, by a Korean philosopher called Byung-Chul Han, who speaks about, he's a very critic of the digital age, actually. He's a romantic. And he claims on this book, The Age of Transparency, that he's actually very critical of the idea of transparency, in the sense that transparency is a totalitarian concept, so he says, where you are forcing everyone, you are coercing everyone to show their cards. But, you know, I would reply him back that actually that's the default state in the world of blockchain. In the world of blockchain, I remember the first time we got some funds in crypto, and I made a transaction to send some of those funds to an exchange and be able to, get some fiat to spend, different things we had to spend. Someone else from the team, sent a text message to the chat group and said, "Hey, I saw the funds move. Was that you, Santi?" And then it hit me. Wow, in this world, with this technology, you have that kind of accountability. Someone in a permissionless way can actually see how you spend the money of the organization. So it really raised the bar on how we control each other and how we provide accountability. So this is Byung-Chul Han says that for trust is important in the sense that for you to trust someone, you need to be able to know that you don't need to know everything about that someone. And that builds, trust requires a mystery. It doesn't require full transparency. And I guess some of that helps build community. But at the same time, we are in a completely different league in the world of crypto. We can see how everyone behaves. And I think it's probably good that we are able to understand how we can work with that in a way that we can help each other. There's probably, the more I understand what this technology can do, the more I understand that it has wider and wider implications, and that we shouldn't be restricting ourselves just to the extremely technical or the very, it's obviously the priority right now because we're in the early days of this, but we need to make sure we pave the way for creating stuff that can really face society and can really work with the trust of society and can really work with, in onboarding all users. We have a long way to go in terms of users, in terms of adoption, a long way to go. I like at the point we are right now. It's an early stage, so we can start making new ways and new methods of working with this stuff, which is very novel in many ways.
I think you guys are among the few teams that are doing really important work and getting real traction along these lines. I mean, when I learned about the pilot project you guys are running in Colorado, and of course, as you said, also that you're, speaking to legislators and regulators in places like Canada and California, that's pretty cool. Very few, projects in crypto can say that. I just want to drill down a tiny bit into accountability. I'm glad you mentioned it. And of course, you were talking about trust as well. I think that they're very closely related. It's funny. Accountability is one of those words that, like, how do I put this? It's not a very sexy word. The first 1,000 times I encountered the idea, I went to business school. We kind of studied, corporate governance and legal studies, and it kind of came up. It was just never something that clicked for me. It never registered. Accountability, like, sounds like accounting, which is like a boring subject,
Yeah.
But like, it's so nuanced. And the more I learn about it, the more I think about it, the more I understand the way the world works, the more I realize that trust is at the center of everything. And accountability is one of the pillars of trust, I think you could say. And, other things I've been learning are, for example, the different organizational structures have very different accountability structures, right? So for instance, I know this is probably quite basic to many people, but I learned that there's a difference between an association and a foundation. And in particular, a foundation doesn't really have, and of course it's different in every jurisdiction, but in kind of, at least in the Swiss kind of Stiftung model, probably in many other places, there's a board of directors. And so, so the foundation itself is accountable to the board, but who's the board accountable to? There aren't stakeholders, there aren't shareholders. Traditionally, it would be donors, right? But there aren't really donors in a lot of these crypto projects. In your case, I guess there are, whereas an association, which is an alternative structure, has members, and it could be quite a large member base. Aragon, for instance, has chosen an association structure rather than a foundation structure. And I'm not sure of the specific details of why they chose it, but I would be surprised if accountability wasn't part of it. Anyway, so if you have any thoughts on accountability, and in particular, who is the Democracy Earth Foundation accountable to? I want to know how you think about that. So
it boils down to this old adagio of who watches the watchman, right? In my more anarchist mindset, I want to find the path for Democracy Earth to evolve from a traditional nonprofit organization. I remember, when we were talking with the lawyers to understand what's the right model for us to work with, whether it's the foundation or association models which you described. Just, how we can transition from that, from something that keeps us all accountable as we use, a network that is purely digital and blockchain based. And what does that kind of accountability mean? This is why I find interesting experiments that are trying to crack the problem of identity and what defines identity and how we connect to identity ourselves. Even simple projects that go with straightforward token curated registry smart contracts like Humanity DAO, which is a first step towards figuring that out. And if a contract like that gets bad players, how that contract can defend itself from those bad players, and that starts going into the mechanics of what we can expect and how we watch the watchmen, how we curate the curators. What is that recursive loop, that feedback loop that keeps us all in check? I think that the ultimate question, when it boils down, when you think about a world that is completely mediated with the use of digital networks and organizations are run by algorithms and AI and all of this stuff, is how we make sure where the humans are and understanding what is maybe our very notions when we think about the concept of a decentralized identity. Maybe that breaks down the concept of individualized identity that has been so common in the modern era, where your identity is usually this one signifier of a name or a social security number or an email address, and you're just that. Whereas, or we go into a world where we experience multiple identities because that's the way you keep your identity decentralized and you keep your rights self-sovereign, and you choose how you engage. You do these different trade-offs on what you reveal and not reveal, because now we have the levers to decide how we work along with that on social and political and economic systems. And that I suspect that there might even the emergence of new political units, new political subjects. It's interesting to see, for example, in social media, the emergence of movements like Me Too or Black Lives Matter, you name it, any hashtag. We even have our own versions of hashtags in the Latin side of politics, and Ni Una Menos, and these are collectives that really represent strong voices. And what we need to make sure when we think as a society is how the intense preferences of the minorities weigh with the weak preferences of the majorities. How we make out those differences and how we find common ground in a way that is not polarizing. That's the, I guess we are very aware of the problem right now with the internet and deepfakes, and we don't know who to trust anymore. We fake news, the media. Donald fucking Trump is the most powerful person on the planet. What happened? How the hell did that happen? Is that a feature or a bug? Is it stretching what's wrong with the past and just making it satire, so we don't longer believe into that?
One of my favorite lines about Donald Trump is that he's pen testing the United States government system. It's one way of framing it.
It's probably it's sucking trust out of everywhere, and it's just turning what used to be formal reality into satire. And it's this phenomenon is happening everywhere. They just elected a comedian as president in Ukraine. They just elected a comedian as president in El Salvador. There's a comedian that got elected in Italy.
Pepe Grillo.
There is people mocking the system, or subconscious social, composition mocking the system and just putting these grenades. This is accelerating I honestly believe that the narrative of the 21st century is like Marxism was the experiment of the 20th with very clear failures. But there are some ideas that permeated the capitalist system if we have intellectual honesty. This century is definitely going to be mediated. The narrative is going to be definitely around these networks. very clearly, just the pace of growth these networks had over the last decade, just extrapolating that in the most conservative way, paints a picture where the 21st century is the century of the internet taking power. And so, yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, I say that my meme for 2019 is popcorn. I think there's two. There's popcorn and fireworks. The popcorn is, you can kind of figure out, that's just kind of like, wow, a lot of crazy shit's going to happen in the next 12, 18, 24 months.
Yeah.
And the fireworks is kind of, you use the word grenade, right? I think we need to kind of run some experiments, set off some fireworks, and just kind of sit back and eat popcorn and kind of see what happens.
Yeah.
But hey, these are all critical and difficult problems. And again, I'm really happy to know that you and folks like Democracy Earth are thinking about them and working on them. We're coming up to an hour, but I want to do a rapid fire round and just ask 2 or 3 kind of closing questions.
Ping pong questions.
All right. So the first one is, what advice do you have for newcomers, for people who are kind of just getting into this community?
Use this stuff. Use it. Don't just read about it. Don't just read the tweets or follow the thought leaders. Just go ahead and use it. Even with 1 cent worth of crypto. Open a collateral debt position in MakerDAO. Put the ETH there. Loan yourself DAI. Then go to Uniswap and trade the DAI for for a Maker token, and then use the Maker token to vote on the governance of the CDP, and then generate more DAI and put it in a liquidity pool in Uniswap and see how the fluctuation of the 0.3% fees that build into your share of the liquidity pool, and then get the token of the liquidity pool and put it. Just use this stuff. The composability, install MetaMask and use SpankChain. We try whatever you want to try, but get yourself familiar, get your hands dirty with how this machine works, and it will start giving you this greater insight that even it will be helpful for you to understand the traditional financial world. I learned stuff about traditional finance because I've used some of this stuff that it's like I know Kung Fu. So my advice to newcomers is use it. It is like the 70s. It is slow. It can be painful. It is a bit cryptic, the UX, but it's the future. And the future, you can make it as much of the present as you want to, and it will be great, very stimulating stuff for your brain.
Couldn't agree more. That's really fantastic. I love that you said that you understand traditional finance better now as well. I say that the great irony for me is I worked in traditional finance for 6 years, and I think I learned more in my first 6 months in the Bitcoin Ethereum community than I did in 6 years in finance about why these things exist. From first principles, right? Why are derivatives useful in the first place? Why do we need them? How do they work? Cool. Thank you for that answer. Next question is, what other people or projects or teams should we speak to as part of this as a series of interviews? Who else is doing good work that may be a little bit unappreciated or underfunded?
Well, I really like, for example, the project of Humanity DAO, what Rich is trying to do on making a very simple, straightforward smart contract that can help build a consensus. I'm saying this in a selfish way because I want to learn more from him. That's a very interesting project that I'm seeing. It would be fun for you to make this with a meme, Moloch DAO, but that's a project that probably already has a lot of attention. But probably maybe some of the like Meta Cartel, that project that tried to fork Moloch DAO and how that works, and everything that is like an alternative to the main narratives of what we see in the world of Ethereum. What else comes to mind? There's this project IDENA that I mentioned that are researching these Turing tests that are machine learning resistant. These guys are from Russia. Really very, very bright guys. Yeah, there's a lot out there. I have a list myself that keeps growing.
I like what you said about speaking to folks who are outside of the traditional or mainstream. I guess that's kind of another way of framing this. And it's also, there's just a funny irony in there because kind of, all of crypto is already a reaction to mainstream. So we're getting very fringe now.
The nerds within the nerds.
Exactly.
The nerds within the nerds. Nerds, the reason San Francisco is successful is because it's this point in the planet that brings all the outcasts from everywhere. And the nerds we're outcasts everywhere. And within the outcasts, who are the outcasts? Where's the alternative of the alternative?
The kingdom of the nerds, kingdom or
yeah.
queendom of the nerds. All right, final question is, what is the one message that you would like to share or let's say broadcast to the Ethereum community? The mic is yours.
Oh, that's a big
choose wisely.
That's a big responsibility. I would say to the Ethereum community, let us remember that we are still in the very early days, that it's very important to be very welcoming to new people, to these technologies, that everyone is eager to learn about them, and it's our responsibility to teach about them and to learn from each other, to come always with an open attitude, to keep a non-dual mindset. I always like an essay from Paul Graham, the founder of YC. It's my favorite essay of all of the essays he wrote. He wrote a lot, very succinct. It's called Keep Your Identity Small. And he argues that the reason why people get so pissed off when they talk about religion, sports, or politics is because we peg our identity to that football team or to that political party or to that religious belief. And when someone attacks that political team, football team, or they're attacking, when someone attacks Boca Juniors, which is the best football team in the world, they're attacking me. It's a personal matter. And that's just silly. We can make that to have fun and poke, make jokes to each other, but we shouldn't take ourselves too seriously, just attach our identity to that. Keep yourself an open mind. Know that these are all approximations to the truth. Don't surrender to dogma. Don't be dogmatic. Dogma leads to fanaticism, and fanaticism doesn't lead to anywhere good. We need to make a place that we can live with each other. We can learn from each other. So let's be cautious about that. I think that Ethereum, from a game theoretic perspective, is in this place that is much more open-minded to experimentation, because it's a system that allows Turing completeness, allows structuring your own rules and playing by those rules and seeing. So it is a place that democratizes new sovereign forms. And that's the reason why that happens, is because we are less judgmental, less dogmatic, less narrow-minded, less about one single vision of the truth, but rather embracing of the contradictions that makes us humans. And we are living paradoxes, and that's the fun part of being alive.
Wow, I got some more shivers down my spine just now. That's really incredible advice. Thank you for sharing your wisdom and opening your heart and opening your soul.
Man, every time I hang out with you, it's always a pleasure to talk. I know that you're very, we think a lot in many ways in a very like-minded way, and it's fantastic. I learn so much from you every single time we hang out. Likewise,
and it's been it's just an honor and a privilege to be able to share these thoughts with the broader community as well. I think that's what we're here for, right? It's about opening the curtains and letting in some light, and just embracing our strengths and our weaknesses together, and trying to plot a course forward. So I think we've taken a step in that direction. So thank you for sharing all these thoughts the past hour.
Let's keep building.
Fiddling.
I don't know if it's still a thing. Probably that's from 2017. Biddle.
Muchas gracias, Santi. Always a pleasure.
A pleasure, my friend.
Thanks for listening. One quick disclosure from this episode before we move on. My family participated in the Democracy Earth Foundation's token sale. Tune in again next week when I'll be back with a conversation with Alejandro Machado of the Open Money Initiative. Along with his colleagues in the initiative, Alejandro is doing some really important research among groups of people like Venezuelan expats who are totally excluded from the modern financial system, to understand how they transact and what money means to them, and with an eye towards building tools to make their lives easier. As always, this show is produced completely on a volunteer basis and is totally self-funded. If you're interested in contributing time or funds to the project, there's information here in the show notes on how to do that. Thanks for listening, and see you back in a few days.